They gave them 12 hours to abandon their own. Fleet Admiral Kalen Reed stood on the command deck of the Terran Mandate ship Resilience, his form a study in stillness against the slow swirl of galactic dust on the main view screen. Before them hung the blue-green jewel of Meridian, an independent colony world that had asked for their protection. Around Meridian, a convoy of civilian transports sat frozen in the void, their engines cold, caught like flies in the amber of a terrible threat. Enclosing them all was the jagged, brutalist geometry of the Voran hegemony fleet, a wall of gunmetal gray warships that bled radiation into the black. The ultimatum had been precise, delivered without ceremony or negotiation. Hegemony doctrine was simple comply or be erased. On the primary tactical display, a crimson timer pulsed with quiet menace, its digits stark against the cool blue of the interface. It read 11:58:12. Reed's knuckles were white where he gripped the command rail, the only sign of the pressure he felt. The choice was to abandon 250,000 souls on Meridian and another 30,000 on the convoy ships, or see his Guardian fleet, outnumbered 3-1, annihilated. "Praxis, run the projection again," Reed said, his voice calm measured. "Use the revised Voron agility coefficients. The ship's mind, its consciousness woven into the very structure of the fleet." Replied without pause, its synthesized voice a smooth counterpoint to the tension on the bridge. "Admiral." The outcome remains consistent. A direct engagement results in a 97.4% probability of total fleet loss. The convoy's survival probability in that scenario is 0. The logic was as cold and unforgiving as the vacuum outside. They would not break faith with those they swore to protect. Commander Eva Rostova, his tactical officer, stepped beside him, her gaze fixed on the enemy formation. "They're arrogant," she murmured, her voice tight with restrained anger. "They've deployed in a standard intimidation pattern, shields, forward weapon ports open. They expect us to run." Reed nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the timer. It was a test not just of strength, but of will. The hegemony did not believe in anything but power. They were about to receive an education in other metrics. They believe their ultimatum is a weapon of the mind. Reed stated more to himself than to his crew. They think fear will do the heavy lifting. The deck plates beneath his feet vibrated with the low, steady hum of the ship's singularity core, a constant reminder of the power he commanded and the power he was reluctant to unleash. He looked at the countdown, a tool meant to inspire panic and fracture resolve. But for him, it was simply a deadline to teach a very hard lesson. A new kind of accounting was about to begin. On board the civilian transport, Stargazer's Hope, a little girl named Alara, pressed her hands against the thick plasteel of the observation lounge window. The warships of the Terran fleet were distant silver slivers, elegant and sharp against the backdrop of stars. The Voron ships were different, like angry, clenched fists. "Are the helpers going to leave, Mama?" she asked, her voice small. Her mother knelt beside her, pulling her close and smoothing her hair. "No, sweet girl. The helpers are here to make sure everyone is safe. They're just being very, very quiet right now." The timer ticked below 11 hours and 45 minutes. Reed turned away from the screen to face his command staff, his expression set. "They have given us their terms. Now we will give them ours." Lieutenant Jian Li, his lead EW specialist, looked up from his console, his fingers dancing across a holographic interface. "Admiral, the preliminary sensor sweeps confirm their network is rigid. High power, low flexibility. They're shouting, not listening. This was the opening they needed. The hegemony's strength was also its greatest weakness: predictability. They built their doctrine on a foundation of fear. Praxis Reed addressed the ship's mind. Begin deployment of the lattice drones. Slow release, minimal thermal signature. I want them seeded in a 30,000-kilometer shell before the Vorons can even register them as anything more than space dust. The AI's voice was immediate. Executing. Estimated deployment time, 4 hours. The drones will remain inert until activated. This fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. The Voron hegemony was about to be entered into the debit column. Rostova's eyebrow arched. The mirror lattice. Sir, that's a deep system survey tool. It's never been tested under combat conditions. Reed's gaze met hers, steady and unyielding. The hegemony has never faced an enemy that refuses to play their game. They expect a charge or a retreat. They will get neither. He was counting on their rigid doctrine, on their arrogant dismissal of tactics that didn't involve overwhelming firepower. The lattice was not a weapon. It was a mirror, and it would show the Vorons only themselves. Humanity would show them a better way. The hours bled away. On the bridge of the Resilience, the atmosphere was a strange mix of serene focus and coiled tension. Every officer was at their station running diagnostics, refining firing solutions they hoped never to use, and monitoring the silent, creeping deployment of thousands of tiny drones. The console glare reflected off their faces, painting them in hues of blue and gold. The only sounds were the soft chime of system confirmations and the whisper of the environmental controls. Praxis maintained a running commentary, its voice a river of data flowing through the command deck. Lattice deployment at 40%. No Voron sensor pings have resolved the drone shells. Their focus remains locked on our primary fleet elements. It was working. The Vorons were so confident in their position that they weren't even looking for subtleties. They ignored the human fleet and the helpless convoy, and for them, the equation was already solved. They were blind in their certainty. A reckoning is not always delivered by a sword. Suddenly, a proximity alert flashed on the tactical display. Energy spike from the Voron flagship Rostova called out, her voice sharp. They're powering main cannons. Reed held up a hand, forestalling any defensive reaction. Hold your positions. They're getting impatient. The Voron ultimatum was built on a psychological clock. When their enemy didn't break, they felt the need to remind them of the stakes. They were predictable. A lance of pure white energy erupted from the lead Voron dreadnought, crossing the void in an instant. It wasn't aimed at the fleet or the convoy. It struck a small, pre-launched sensor probe that had been deliberately placed in a conspicuous orbit. The probe vaporized in a silent flash of light, a punctuation mark in the hegemony's statement of intent. The message was clear. This is what awaits you. The countdown clock on the screen now read 07:12:43. The demonstration was over. They thought a show of force would break their will. All stations report. Reed commanded, his voice unchanged. The reports came in crisp and professional from across the fleet. No one had flinched. No one had panicked. The coolant hiss from a nearby conduit was louder than any nervous chatter. The hegemony had made their move expecting fear. They found only resolve. Praxis have the drones reach their final positions. The AI responded instantly. Affirmative, Admiral. The mirror lattice is fully deployed and awaiting activation. Reed allowed himself a small, grim smile. Then it's time to change the board. He turned to Lieutenant Lee. Jin, prepare to activate the lattice on my mark. Phase 1, chaotic reflection. Let's make their sensor screens scream. Lee's fingers flew across his console, a confident grin touching his lips. "Aye, Admiral. We're about to give them a hall of mirrors." The mystery of the strange deployment was about to pay off. The Vorans believed they were the predators, watching their cornered prey. It was time to remind them that traps have teeth. From his office on Meridian, Governor Eris Thorne watched the silent flash of the destroyed probe on his long-range monitor. His knuckles were raw from hours of gripping his desk. He opened a secure channel to the Resilience. "Admiral Reed," he said. His voice strained but steady, he saw that. "Our people are tense, but they are holding. We have faith in you." Reed's face appeared on the screen, a mask of calm authority. "Hold that faith, Governor. The night is not over. We have no intention of abandoning Meridian." The promise was an anchor in a storm of fear. Reed's confidence was not a bluff. It was a calculated certainty. He knew his crew, he knew his ship, and he knew his enemy. The Vorans operated from a playbook written 1,000 years ago, one that had never failed them, because no one had ever dared to write a new one. Their doctrine was a cage they had built for others, but they had locked themselves inside it as well. They saw the universe in terms of hammers and nails. Tonight they would learn about the Forge. "Praxis open a fleet-wide channel," Reed ordered. His voice resonated through every ship under his command, from the mighty Resilience to the smallest escort frigate. "All vessels, this is the Admiral. The hegemony has made its statement. We will now make ours. The convoy will begin its departure sequence on my mark. Guardian Fleet will provide cover. Trust the lattice. Trust the plan. Read out." A chorus of acknowledgments rippled back through the command channel. The ultimatum timer showed just under 6 hours remaining. Commander Rostova signaled the convoy. "It's time to move." Rostova nodded, her jaw set. "Signal away, Admiral." "The sheep are running." Reed corrected her gently. "Not sheep, Commander. They are our people. We are their shepherds." The distinction was critical. It was the heart of their own doctrine. The convoy ship engines began to glow one by one, their fusion torches painting streaks of defiant blue against the black. They did not defend ships. They defended souls. The moment the civilian ships began to move, the Voron fleet reacted. Their ships shifted energy signatures climbing as they prepared to enforce their blockade. They were a predator scenting blood. "Voron weapon ports are hot." Rostova reported, her voice level. Multiple targeting locks detected on the lead convoy vessels. Reed's eyes were on the tactical map, watching the intricate dance of icons. "Now, Lieutenant Lee," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Activate the lattice." Lee's hands closed over the activation controls. Lattice is live. Across the void, reality flickered and broke. Thousands of drones previously invisible now came online. They did not generate their own signals. They simply caught the powerful sensor pings of the Voron fleet and reflected them back, amplified and distorted. On the Voron command bridges, their tactical displays, once clean and orderly, must have dissolved into a nightmare of false signals and ghost readings. Their own eyes were turned against them. A single human fleet of 30 warships suddenly appeared as 300. The convoy, a simple line of transports, now looked like a swarm of attacking dreadnoughts. Every pulse the Voron sent out to find their targets returned as a scream of nonsensical data. Their automated targeting systems, designed for efficiency and brute force, began to chase phantoms across the battlefield. The clean lines of the hegemony's formation wavered their rigid discipline, cracking under the strain of informational chaos. "The trap is sprung," Rostova breathed, watching the Voron ships begin to fire. Lances of energy tore through the space between the fleets, but they were aimed at nothing. They were firing at ghosts, at echoes of their own making. The human fleet meanwhile held its fire-conserving energy, its movements masked by the swirling storm of data. The convoy continued its slow, steady acceleration, slipping through the gaps in the now disorganized blockade. A battle is won first in the mind, then in the void. But the Vorons were not fools. Their commander, whoever he was, would not be deceived for long. "They're shifting sensor modes," Lee reported, his brow furrowed in concentration. "They're trying to burn through the reflections with raw power." A new wave of focused energy washed over the human fleet. On the bridge, the lights flickered for a second, and the deck hummed with the strain on the ship's shields. The cost of this maneuver was beginning to be tallied. Praxis Reed asked, "What's the status of the Lattice drones?" The AI's voice was coolly analytical. 17% of the drones have been overloaded by the focused sensor sweep. The integrity of the Lattice is degrading. The mirror was cracking. Rostova, their formation is tightening. The flagship is turning to intercept the Stargazer's hope. They've found a real target. The hegemony was adapting their rage, cutting through the confusion. The real fight was about to begin. Their brutality was as reliable as the tides. "It's not enough to blind them," Reed said. "We have to teach them that firing blind has consequences." He looked at Lee. "It's time for Phase 2. Can you isolate the targeting systems of the 2 destroyers on their starboard flank?" Lee's face was slick with sweat, but his eyes were bright. "It's a fine needle to thread, Admiral, but I can do it. I can make them see what I want them to see." This was the true purpose of the Lattice, the reveal that would turn the battle on its head. The mirror lattice was more than a simple reflector. Each drone had a micro wormhole comm that allowed it to communicate with its neighbors instantaneously. They could shape the reflected signals, not just bounce them. They could paint a masterpiece of deception on the enemy's canvas. "Make them see our frigate, the TMS Lancer, right between them," Reed ordered. It was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of fiction made of light and energy. "We will write the ledger of this battle in their own ink." On the bridges of the Voron destroyers, Iron Hand and Grasping Void, their tactical officers would have seen the same thing, a clear shot at a human frigate that had broken cover. Their doctrine was clear: destroy the enemy. Without waiting for confirmation from their flagship, which was still wrestling with the larger ghost signals they both fired. 2 converging beams of high-energy plasma screamed toward a location in space that was completely empty. Except it wasn't empty to their sensors. And more importantly, their 2 ships were on opposite sides of that empty space. As their beams crossed the point where the Phantom Lancer was supposed to be, they continued on their path. The beam from the Iron Hand slammed into the shields of the Grasping Void. The beam from the Grasping Void hammered the Iron Hand. Both ships convulsed their shields, flaring violently before collapsing under the unexpected friendly assault. Their own weapons became their judgment. Alarms blared across the bridge of the Resilience as the feedback from the impact washed over them. "Direct hits." Rostova yelled, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "2 Voron destroyers have fired upon each other. Shields are down. We're reading secondary explosions on the Iron Hand." The hegemony's rigid command structure and aggressive doctrine had been turned against them. They were so eager to kill, they had become their own executioners. This was the lesson. Not destruction, but consequence. Reed had not fired a single shot yet. 2 of the enemy's ships were crippled. He had forced the hegemony to punch itself in the face. A low murmur of awe and relief rippled through the command deck. The crew had seen the plan on paper, but to witness it in action was something else entirely. The air thick with tension now tasted of victory. The scent of ozone from a nearby relay overload was the perfume of success. We hold the line by turning their strength into a weakness. The Voron fleet commander, however, was learning fast. The remaining ships ceased their wild firing. A new command must have been issued, a full system. Purge a blanket of electronic warfare designed to deafen and blind everyone, including themselves. The lattice is collapsing, Lee warned, his voice strained. They're rebooting their entire sensor network. We'll have about 90 seconds of total chaos, and then they'll come back online with a clean picture. The window of opportunity was closing. Praxis. Reed snapped, what is the convoy's status? 70% of the civilian ships are past the effective blockade line, the AI reported, but the trailing group, including the Stargazer's Hope, is still vulnerable. 90 seconds. Not enough time for them to escape. The Voron fleet, silent and furious, was about to awaken from its confusion, and when it did, its retribution would be swift and total. They would have to pay for every second gained. A frigate, the TMS Arrowhead, one of the convoy's close escorts, suddenly flared its engines. Its captain's voice came over the command channel, tight and determined. "Admiral, we're taking a hit." A stray shot from one of the destroyers caught our port engine nacelle. "We're venting plasma." Reed's jaw tightened. This was the cost he knew was coming. The chaotic reflections, while effective, were not perfect. A piece of the mirror had broken and cut one of their own. "Report status," Reed demanded. "Wounded, sir. 6 wounded in engineering, but the bulkheads are holding. We've lost maneuverability, but our forward batteries are still online." The captain's voice didn't waver. They were hurt, but they were not out of the fight. The tangible cost of their strategy was now on the board. The ledger was no longer clean. It was balanced with the blood of his crew. A just cause does not make the sacrifice easy. The Voron fleet began to re-emerge from the electronic fog. Their icons on the tactical display solidified their formation, already shifting into a vengeful pursuit vector. The 90 seconds were almost up. The trailing convoy ships were exposed, their engines burning at maximum, but they were too slow. The lead Voron cruiser was already acquiring a firing solution on the Stargazer's Hope. The game of mirrors was over. Praxis Reed said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You mentioned a secondary protocol for the lattice drones. The Cascade option." The bridge crew looked up. This was a mystery to them, a contingency buried deep in the plan. The AI's synthesized voice was steady. "Protocol. Cascade is a high-risk terminal function, Admiral. It will achieve the objective, but the lattice will be a total loss." It was a final desperate move. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. "Explain the risk," Reed demanded, his eyes locked on the approaching Voron cruiser. "The protocol instructs the remaining drones to use their maneuvering thrusters for a single coordinated burn. They will physically converge on a designated target, not as weapons, but as kinetic chaff. Their combined mass is negligible, but their velocity and density upon arrival will create a temporary but blinding sensor whiteout localized to the target vessel." Rostova's eyes widened. A kinetic fog. "You want to throw the drones at them?" It was an audacious, almost insane idea. Not to do damage, but to create a final impenetrable screen of noise and metal, sacrificing the entire multi-billion credit lattice in the process. The risk Praxis Reed repeated. "The burn calculations are complex. A miscalculation could send the cloud into the convoy ships instead of the enemy. It was a knife-edge decision, with thousands of civilian lives on the line. Hold the count, for the reckoning is at hand. Target the lead cruiser." Reed commanded, his decision absolute. "Give the convoy the time it needs. Execute Protocol Cascade. Now." On his command, thousands of drones across a vast swath of space ignited their tiny thrusters in a single synchronized pulse. They were no longer a network. They were a swarm. A cloud of metal hornets launched at a single point their course, a fine drawn line between salvation and disaster. The Voron cruiser, its weapons charged to fire on the helpless transport, was suddenly engulfed. Its sensors just rebooted, and pristine, were instantly overwhelmed by a maelstrom of high-velocity impacts. It was like trying to see through a sandstorm at point-blank range. The ship wasn't damaged, but it was rendered utterly blind and deaf. Its targeting locks broken, its commanders furious and impotent. The convoy ship slipped past it, their engines screaming as they raced for the safety of open space. Their arrogance was a blindfold. We merely tightened. The rest of the Voron fleet, seeing their lead ship suddenly neutralized, hesitated. That hesitation was all the human fleet needed. All Guardian vessels. Reed's voice rang out, execute Phase 3. We are no longer defending. We are punching a hole. Form a spearhead on me. The Terran warships, which had been patiently holding their positions, now surged forward. Their engines flared to life, and they fell into a tight, aggressive formation, driving like a wedge toward the disorganized Voron lines. They weren't aiming for a decisive battle. They were making a statement. They were demonstrating that they could and would meet force, with force, when required. The lead ships fired precise, targeted shots, not at hulls, but at the weapon emplacements of the nearest Voron ships. They were disarming them, not destroying them. It was a message sent in the universal language of focused energy. We are not weak. We are restrained. Do not confuse the two. We teach with patience. But the lessons will be learned. The Voron commander. His fleet in disarray, 2 ships crippled by their own fire, and his lead cruiser blinded, finally made a choice. He had underestimated his opponent. His perfect, unblemished record of enforcing the hegemony's will was shattered. The ultimatum clock still counting down on the main screen of the Resilience was now a monument to his failure. It had been a tool of intimidation, but Reed had turned it into a measure of the hegemon's arrogance. The Voron fleet is disengaging, Rostova announced, a note of disbelief in her voice. They're actually turning away. The brutalist gray ships began to execute slow, clumsy turns, their formation broken, their pride wounded more deeply than their hulls. They were not retreating in a tactical sense. They were fleeing the scene of a strategic humiliation. They had come expecting to dictate terms to a lesser power. They left having been taught a lesson in humility. Their doctrine failed its first true test. Reed watched them go, his expression unreadable. He had won. The convoy was safe. Meridian was secure, and he had done it with minimal bloodshed on his own side. But the cost was still there. The frigate Arrowhead was limping, its crew wounded. The expensive experimental mirror lattice was gone, expended in a final, brilliant act of defiance. Victory was never clean. There was always a price on the ledger. Praxis, he said softly, as the last Voron ship vanished into hyperspace. Stop the clock. On the main view screen, the Crimson Ultimatum timer froze at 02:47:13. It remained there, a silent testament to the moment the hegemony's will had been broken. It was a trophy, a symbol that ultimatums were only as strong as the fear they inspired. And today, they had found an opponent who did not fear them. They had found an opponent who had come to teach. Open the books and let the numbers speak for themselves. A cheer erupted on the bridge, a spontaneous wave of relief and triumph that broke the disciplined silence. Officers clapped each other on the shoulder, their faces lit with weary smiles. Rostova allowed herself a broad grin, turning to the Admiral. A masterful lesson, sir. I don't think they'll forget it. Reed nodded, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. They won't, he agreed. But this was just the first lecture. The final exam is yet to come. He knew the hegemony. Their doctrine was more than a strategy. It was a religion. They would not take this humiliation lying down. They would return not with an ultimatum, but with an armada. They would come to burn away their shame, to erase the memory of their failure from the galactic record. This was not an ending. It was the opening move in a much larger and much more dangerous game. The vibration of the ship's deck felt different now, not a hum of readiness, but a thrum of anticipation. They had awoken a sleeping giant, and now they would face the storm. Gian, I want a full analysis of the Voron retreat vector. Reed ordered, his mind already shifting to the next phase. Praxis begins sifting through all captured sensor data from the engagement. Look for weaknesses in their power distribution, their shield harmonics, anything we can use. The celebration was over. The work continued. He walked over to the tactical display, where the icon for the damaged frigate Arrowhead was blinking. And get me the chief medical officer on the Arrowhead. I want a personal report on every one of our wounded. The cost had to be acknowledged. The victory had to be measured against the pain it caused. That was the difference between them and the hegemony. They fought for people, not for principles written in stone. They bled, they hurt, and they remembered. As he stood there watching his fleet begin the slow process of reforming, of tending to its wounds, and counting its remaining strength, he knew this single system was no longer just a place on a star chart. It had become a symbol. It was the anchor against a rising tide of tyranny. A priority message blinked on his command console. It was from the Stargazer's Hope, the lead civilian transport. He opened it. The screen filled with a low-resolution image from the ship's observation lounge. It was packed with people, families, children, crew, all cheering, many of them in tears. They were holding up handwritten signs, the words barely legible, but the sentiment clear. Thank you, Guardian Fleet. In the front, a little girl with bright eyes was holding a drawing of a sleek Terran warship. Reed felt a tightness in his chest. This was why they held the line. Not for glory, not for territory, not for ideology. For this, for the simple, profound right of people to live their lives in peace, free from the shadow of brutal ultimatums and the threats of those who believed might made right. He sent a simple message back. We are honored to serve. He knew with a certainty that chilled him that the Voron reprisal fleet would not make the same mistakes. They would come with overwhelming, undeniable force. They had to be ready to reflect a much larger fire. Admiral Praxis's voice cut through his thoughts. I have completed a preliminary analysis of the Voron retreat vectors and their communications chatter during the final moments of the engagement. Reed turned his full attention to the AI. Go on. The synthesized voice was laden with an unusual gravity. Their communications were chaotic. But one phrase was repeated across their command channel originating from their flagship. It was a directive, Admiral. A name. A sense of foreboding settled over Reed. What was the name Praxis? The AI paused for a fraction of a second, as if to process the weight of the information. He is one of their old guard, a relic from the hegemony's founding wars. They call him the Accountant. His personal flagship is the Final Reckoning. The name sent a shiver down Reed's spine. It was a title that spoke not of mindless brutality, but of cold, meticulous, and total annihilation. A man who didn't just defeat his enemies, but balanced their accounts to zero. A new player had entered the game. Rostova Reed said, his voice grim. Cross-reference that name with our fleet intelligence archives. I want to know everything about this Accountant. The easy victory suddenly felt fragile, a temporary reprieve before a much greater storm. They had beaten a predictable commander playing by a rigid rulebook. But a man called the accountant suggested something far more dangerous: an enemy who understood the true nature of ledgers. An enemy who would come not to issue an ultimatum, but to collect a debt he believed he was owed. The initial relief that had washed over the fleet began to recede, replaced by a colder, harder reality. They had won the Battle of Meridian, but in doing so, they may have just started a war they were not prepared for. The hegemony had been bloodied and embarrassed. Their response would be tailored to the insult. It would be precise, it would be overwhelming, and it would be guided by a mind that saw entire civilizations as numbers on a balance sheet. The real test of their resolve was not behind them. It was waiting for them, just beyond the horizon. They had taught a lesson. Now school was truly in session. Rostova's report came back within the hour, her face a pale mask in the glow of the holographic display she projected onto the main bridge. "Admiral, our intelligence on this accountant is thin. His real name is Xylo, a Voron purist. He commanded the final pacification of the Cygnus Reach rebellions. He's not a bludgeon like the last commander. He's a scalpel." The display shifted, showing tactical diagrams from a past conflict. They were precise, elegant, and utterly ruthless. Xylo's strategy was clear. He never engaged in battles of attrition. He identified the single point of failure in an enemy's society, a key resource, a political linchpin, a philosophical weakness, and he severed it with surgical precision. The physical destruction was always secondary to the moral collapse that followed. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he made them dismantle themselves. His flagship, the Final Reckoning, was rumored to be more of a mobile command and control nexus than a traditional dreadnought. A colder fear was beginning to settle in. He is a creature of doctrine, just like the other one. Reed observed, his voice steady. But his doctrine is more insidious. He won't use an ultimatum of time. He'll use an ultimatum of choice. He turned to Praxis. What is the estimated arrival time for a Voron reprisal fleet of this caliber? The AI's response was instantaneous, a chillingly calm calculation. Given standard Voron hyperspace capabilities and the priority this defeat would engender, a fleet led by Xylo could be here in less than 72 hours. 3 days. 3 days to prepare for an enemy who didn't play by any rules they had previously encountered. 3 days to steel themselves for a battle that would be fought not just in the void, but in the hearts and minds of everyone in the Meridian system. The low hum of the ship's life support seemed to grow louder, a constant reminder of the fragile lives depending on their next moves. Their victory had only bought them time. The order was given. The Guardian fleet re-established a defensive perimeter, but it was different this time. It was a web, not a wall. They moved the remaining civilian ships to the far side of Meridian, using the planet's gravity well as a shield. The wounded from the Arrowhead were ferried down to the planet's advanced medical facilities. The bond between the fleet and the colony was no longer one of a protector and a protected. It was a single unified entity, bracing for a shared storm. On Meridian, Governor Thorne addressed his people. His face projected on public screens across the planet's cities was tired, but resolute. "We are not alone," he told them. "We have allies who honor their word, but our trial is not over. We must be prepared. Conserve power. Secure your homes, and trust in those who stand guard in the darkness for us." The people of Meridian responded not with panic, but with a quiet, determined industry. They began to prepare. A shared fate forges the strongest alliances. Reed spent the next cycle in the ship's archive studying every scrap of data on Xylo with Praxis. Commander Rostova drilled the fleet in new tactical formations, designed for flexibility over firepower. Lieutenant Lee, his face illuminated by cascading code, worked tirelessly to find any weakness in the Voron's legendary network security. They were a well-oiled machine, but they were a machine preparing for a fight against a ghost. "He will not attack the fleet directly," Reed concluded, standing before the main tactical display late in the second cycle. "That's what we expect. That's what he knows we expect. He will attack the very idea of our mission here." Praxis overlaid a new set of projections on the map. His optimal strategy would be to create a scenario where our core principles, the protection of civilian life and the refusal to bow to threats, are placed in direct opposition to each other. The AI was learning the nuances of human philosophy. Their greatest strength was now their greatest target. The third cycle arrived, and with it the Voron fleet. They did not drop out of hyperspace in a show of force. They simply appeared, their ships materializing from the void like phantoms at the system's edge. There were over 100 of them, led by a vessel that dwarfed the others. It was a long, dagger-like ship, its surface a seamless expanse of black alloy that seemed to drink the starlight. The final reckoning. The new fleet did not advance. It did not issue threats. It began to deploy a vast system-spanning network of sensor arrays, their complexity far exceeding the mirror lattice the humans had used. The deck plates of the Resilience thrummed with the energy of the ship's own active sensors, straining to understand what they were seeing. This was not a preparation for battle. It was a dissection. The accountant was laying his instruments out on the operating table. He was preparing to make his first incision. Then came the message. It was not broadcast on a military frequency. It was sent on a wide-beam civilian channel addressed to Governor Thorne of Meridian, but copied to the entire system. Xylo's voice was not the guttural growl they expected. It was calm, articulate, almost academic. He did not issue an ultimatum. He presented what he called a settlement of accounts. The Terran Mandate Fleet. Xylo's voice echoed on the bridge of the Resilience as, through its reckless actions, endangered the lives of non-combatants in this system. My purpose here is not to punish, but to restore balance. The offer was simple. He would grant every single civilian transport safe passage out of the system, completely unmolested. They would be free to go. In exchange, the Terran fleet was to power down its weapons and submit to inspection. It was a trap made of mercy. Governor Thorne immediately patched through to read his face a storm of fury and conflict. "It's a lie." Admiral Atrick, Reed held up a hand. "Of course it is, Governor, but it's a very clever one." Xylo had bypassed him entirely. He had made an offer of pure, unadulterated salvation to the very people Reed was sworn to protect. If Reed accepted, his fleet was lost. If he refused, he would be the one holding 30,000 civilians hostage, standing in the way of their freedom. Xylo was turning the board. He was making Reed the villain of the story. The mystery of the accountant's strategy was revealed, and its genius was terrifying. He wasn't attacking their ships. He was attacking their moral authority. Rostova slammed her fist on her console. "He's trying to break the alliance. If the civilians pressure us to accept, we're finished." The suit's internal heartbeat monitor in Reed's ear remained slow and steady, a calm counterpoint to the rising crisis. They were being weighed on a scale of their own making. Praxis. Reed said, turning to face the optical sensor that represented the AI. "Run a psychological profile. If I refuse this offer, what is the likely reaction from the convoy population?" The AI processed the request for a few seconds. There is a 68% probability of significant dissent among the convoy captains. They are civilians, Admiral. Their primary directive is the preservation of their passengers. Xylo is offering them exactly that, with no immediate cost to themselves. The choice was impossible: sacrifice his fleet or sacrifice the trust of the people he was protecting. This was the accountant's scalpel. He had found the seam between the fleet and the colony and was preparing to cut it open. The countdown clock of the previous engagement had been a crude instrument of fear. This offer was a sophisticated weapon of doubt. He was forcing them to choose between their shield and their soul. But Reed saw the flaw. Xylo, for all his intellect, was still a creature of hegemony doctrine. He believed that all beings were fundamentally selfish. He was betting that the civilians would save themselves at the expense of the fleet. He did not account for the possibility of a different kind of ledger one, where loyalty and honor were worth more than simple survival. He had miscalculated the human spirit. Governor Thorne Reed said, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity, "I am going to refuse his offer. But I need you to stand with me. I need your people to trust us just for a little while longer." Thorne looked at Reed, saw the conviction in his eyes, and gave a slow, determined nod. "They will, Admiral. You showed us what faith was worth. We will not forget." The alliance held. It was the first crack in the accountant's perfect plan. A bond of trust is a weapon he cannot quantify. Reed opened a channel system-wide, his own voice cutting through the silent tension. "Accountant Xylo, this is Fleet Admiral Kalen Reed of the Terran Mandate. Your offer is noted, and it is refused." He kept it short, direct, offering no explanation. He would not engage in a debate. He would simply deny Xylo the moral victory he craved. The silence that followed was profound. On the tactical display, the Voron fleet did not move. Xylo was processing this. His gambit had failed. The humans were not behaving according to his projections. "He's reevaluating," Rostova murmured. His primary psychological attack was just parried. Reed nodded. "Now he will revert to a more conventional strategy. He will try to force our hand." The heat from the command console felt warm against his palms, a grounding sensation in the sea of uncertainty. Sometimes the most powerful move is to refuse to play. Xylo's response came a few minutes later. "So be it, Admiral Reed. The account will be settled in a more traditional manner. You have made your choice. The consequences are now your own." With that, the Voron fleet began to advance. But it was not a charge. They moved with the slow, inexorable grace, spreading out to form a perfect, inescapable sphere of influence around Meridian and the Terran fleet. They were not preparing for a battle. They were preparing for a siege. A true siege, cutting off the system from the rest of the galaxy, a slow, methodical starvation. This was the escalation Reed had anticipated. Xylo, having failed to break them psychologically, would now try to break them physically. He would turn the system into a prison, and he would be the warden. They had defied the executioner. Now they faced the grinding stone. A young tech on the civilian freighter, Celestial Wanderer, watched the Voron ships advance on the lounge view screen. He was barely 20 on his first long-haul run. He turned to his captain, a grizzled veteran of the trade lanes. "They're going to kill us all, aren't they?" The captain took a long sip of her synth coffee and stared at the screen, her reflection ghosting over the enemy fleet. "Kid," she said, her voice rough but steady. That human admiral didn't blink. "We owe him the same courtesy to say. We hold the line right here." The siege began. Days turned into a week. The Voron fleet did nothing but hold its position, a silent, suffocating presence. Life on Meridian and in the convoy continued, but under a shadow. Resources were rationed. The constant tension was a weight on everyone's shoulders. Reed knew that time was Xylo's new weapon. He was waiting for their fuel to run low, for their resolve to crumble under the strain of waiting for an end that never seemed to come. Patience can be the cruelest weapon of all. He's mapping the system's gravimetrics praxis reported on the 8th day of the siege. His sensor arrays are charting every gravitational anomaly from the planetoids in the outer belt to the micro-singularities within the star's corona. It is an unusually thorough survey for a military blockade. This was the mystery, the piece that didn't fit. Why would a fleet commander care so much about gravity? Reed stood before the tactical map, a universe of possibilities swirling in his mind. Xylo was a scalpel. He didn't make superfluous moves. The gravity survey was part of his plan. He's not just building a cage. Praxis Reed said, a sudden chilling realization dawning on him. He's learning the shape of the lock. He was preparing the battlefield to his own advantage, using the very laws of physics as his allies. He wasn't just commanding a fleet. He was orchestrating the void itself. "We can't wait for him to make his move," Reed declared. "We have to force him into a new position. We have to give him a target he can't resist." Rostova looked up from her station. "Sir, a direct assault is suicide." "I'm not talking about an assault," Reed countered. "I'm talking about an escape. We are going to make it look like the convoy is making a desperate run for it through the weakest point in his blockade." It was the ultimate bait. Xylo's entire strategy was predicated on holding them there. An attempted breakout would be a direct challenge to his control. He would have to react, and in that reaction, he would reveal his hand. "Praxis," Lieutenant Lee Reed said, turning to his key officers. "I want you to design a ghost fleet. We will use every decoy, every electronic warfare trick we have. We will make it look like the entire convoy is moving protected by our fastest frigates." They would forge a key of deception to unlock his cage. The plan was a massive gamble. It would require them to expend a significant portion of their remaining energy reserves on a single all-or-nothing feint. If Xylo didn't take the bait, or if he saw through the deception, they would be left exposed and weakened, their bluff called. The faint hiss of the recycled air on the bridge was the only sound for a long moment, as the command crew absorbed the audacity of the plan. The weakest point in his formation, Praxis, stated, highlighting a sector on the tactical map, is a corridor aligned with the system's primary gravitational axis, leading toward the gas giant Erebus. It seemed too perfect. A straight shot out of the system. "It's a trap," Rostova said immediately. "He left that corridor open on purpose. He wants us to go that way." Reed smiled grimly. "I know, and we are going to walk right into it. A trap is only a trap if you don't see the walls." This was the core of Reed's counter-strategy. He would not just trigger Xylo's trap, he would turn it inside out. The accountant's meticulous gravity survey was the clue. He intended to use the natural gravity wells of the system to his advantage to shepherd his targets into a pre-arranged kill box. Reed's plan was to hijack that kill box and make Xylo the one who was caught inside. "Praxis," Reed ordered, "I need to know the location of every single piece of salvage, every derelict research probe, every forgotten mining drone in this system's outer belt. Cross-reference that with the locations of the old deep space survey stations. Specifically, I'm looking for anything with a first-generation gravity projector." It was a long shot, a desperate search for a hidden advantage. The payoff for this mystery, if it existed, would be immense. Sometimes the past provides the weapons for the future. The AI's search took hours. Finally, it returned with a result. There are 3 defunct astronomical research stations in the Erebus sector, Admiral. They were part of a project to study the gas giant's magnetosphere. Records indicate their primary gravity projectors were left intact when the stations were abandoned. They were old, outdated, and probably half destroyed. But they were there, A plan audacious and terrifying began to form in Reed's mind. It was a strategy that could only be conceived by an opponent who understood the mind of a man like Xylo. It was a plan that relied on turning the accountant's own meticulous systems-based warfare back on him. It was a way to settle the account once and for all. Praxis Reed said, his voice low and intense. Begin calculating a remote activation sequence for those projectors. We will build our own walls from the bones of his plan. The feint began at the start of the next cycle. A swarm of decoy signatures perfectly mimicking the energy profiles of the civilian transports and their frigate escorts launched from behind Meridian. They accelerated hard into the open corridor, a desperate-looking charge for freedom. On the bridge of the Resilience, every crew member held their breath, their eyes glued to the tactical display. The console glare reflected in their wide eyes, painting a scene of unbearable tension. For a moment, the Voran fleet did not react. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, a third of Xylo's fleet peeled away from the main blockade and gave chase. They moved with predatory speed, their icons on the map converging on the fleeing decoys, funneling them deeper into the corridor. Xylo had taken the bait. He was moving his ships exactly where Reed wanted them. The bait is taken. The line is drawn. He's committing his fastest cruisers. Rostova reported, her voice tight. They're moving to cut off the escape route just as we predicted. He's boxing them in. The accountant was too arrogant to believe it was a trick. He saw a desperate enemy making a foolish move, and his doctrine demanded he punish it decisively. He was so focused on the fleeing convoy that he didn't see the true nature of the corridor he was entering. Reed watched as the Voran pursuit fleet crossed a predetermined line in the tactical display. They were now perfectly positioned between the 3 derelict research stations. They were in the kill box. They just didn't know it yet. Lieutenant Lee Reed commanded, his voice as sharp as breaking ice. Activate the projectors! Now! Lee's hands flew across his console. A single command pulsed out into the darkness. The ledger is open. The debt is called. Across the void, the ancient gravity projectors on the 3 dead stations sputtered to life. Power rerouted from the Resilience itself in a massive single-shot surge poured into their decayed mechanisms. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the fabric of space-time in the corridor warped. It did not become a crushing singularity. It became a subtle but irresistible river, a gravity current pulling everything within the corridor toward the massive gas giant Erebus. The Voran ships traveling at high speed were suddenly caught in a current they could not see. Their navigators would have seen their course vectors begin to deviate their engines, suddenly straining against an invisible force. Alarms would be screaming on their bridges. Xylo's perfect trap, the one he had so carefully prepared using the system's natural gravity, had been hijacked. Reed had created his own gravity well, turning the open corridor into a one-way street to oblivion. Their prison was not made of bars, but of the universe itself. It's working, Rostova gasped. Their fleet is being dragged off course. They're fighting it, but the current is too strong. The Voran ships were now caught in an impossible dilemma. To escape the gravity current, they had to turn and burn their engines at maximum power against it. But doing so would leave them stationary, helpless targets. To continue their pursuit meant being dragged inexorably into the crushing atmosphere of Erebus. Xylo was a brilliant strategist, but he had been outthought. Reed had not played his game of ships and guns. He had played the game of physics, and he had won. The accountant's meticulous survey had been the very tool Reed used to defeat him. The trap had been turned inside out. The hunters were now the hunted, trapped not by weapons, but by the fundamental forces of their own universe. Their own engines became the instruments of their defeat. Praxis. Reed ordered, his voice ringing with authority. Open a channel to the final reckoning. All frequencies. And start the broadcast. On every screen in the Voron fleet, and on an open channel for the entire galaxy to witness, a new display appeared. It was a simple Stark ledger. It listed every ship in Xylo's pursuit fleet. And next to each name, a set of numbers began to climb rapidly: core temperature, fuel consumption, and hull stress. Reed was not firing a single weapon. He was simply showing the accountant the price of his own aggression. He was forcing him to watch his own fleet tear itself apart, cooking its crews and burning its fuel reserves to nothing just to stay still. This was the true accounting. Accountant Xylo Reed's voice boomed across the channel. Your account is overdrawn. The price of your aggression is the slow death of your fleet. You have one choice. Surrender now, or I will let the laws of physics balance your books for you. The reckoning was not a threat. It was a calculation. Aboard the final reckoning, Xylo must have watched in cold fury as his elite cruisers burned themselves out. He was caught. There was no countermove. Reed had used his own meticulous nature against him, creating a problem that could not be solved with firepower. His own pursuit of a flawless victory had led him into a flawless trap. The cost of victory was suddenly starkly too high. The deep thrum of the Resilience's overloaded power conduits was a symphony of triumph, the cost willingly paid for this final checkmate. A single word came back over the channel, clipped and full of a hatred that transcended the electronic transmission surrender. The Voron ships, one by one, powered down their engines, their forward momentum lost. They began to drift, caught in the gentle but firm grip of the artificial gravity current, which now served not as a weapon, but as a shepherd's crook, guiding them into a helpless, controlled orbit. The trap was now a cage. A debt of violence is paid in the currency of humiliation. The battle was over. The great Voron reprisal fleet was defeated without a single shot fired in anger by the Terran mandate. The cost had been high. The gravity projectors were fused slag, and the Resilience had suffered a series of controlled plasma burns from the massive power surge. But the victory was absolute. The public broadcast of the Voron fleet's self-immolation was a galactic incident. The hegemony's doctrine of ultimatums and intimidation was exposed not just as cruel, but as strategically bankrupt. On the floor of the Galactic Concordat, the footage played on a loop. The tally of the Voron fleet's rising heat levels became a symbol of their hubris. A motion was passed sanctioned by a dozen star nations. The Voron hegemony's ultimatum doctrine was declared an act of illegal aggression, and their voting privileges in the Concordat were rescinded until full reparations were made to Meridian. The precedent was locked. A line had been drawn across the stars. The ledger of history had been balanced. On the bridge of the Resilience, the tactical display showed the Voron ships being disarmed by Terran marine detachments. The red glow of their strained engine ports had cooled to a dull, inert pewter. The tally board, which had broadcast their slow defeat, now simply read, "Account settled." Reed stood watching the image of Meridian safe and sovereign on the main view screen. He had been a soldier, a tactician, an admiral. Today, he had been something more. He thought of the choices made, the restraint, and the decisiveness, the fine line between mercy and justice. Strength was not the power to issue demands from the bridge of a dreadnought. It was the will to hold the line for those who could not, to answer threats with ingenuity, and to teach the arrogant that some values were not negotiable. The true measure of power was not in the ledger of ships destroyed, but in the simple, quiet fact of a world left free. A new precedent was written not in law, but in light.